Welcome back to the news today. This is the Daily Debate. Well, the Israel Defense Force announced late Saturday night that it's opened criminal investigations into 8 more incidents during the summer's war in Gaza. Well, that now makes a total of 13 under criminal investigation. Specifically in focus are Israeli military strikes on hospitals, UN facilities, and Red Crescent workers during the 50-day conflict that left nearly 202,000, that is, 200 Palestinians and 73 Israelis dead. Well, with us to discuss the issue is Bradley Burston, a columnist and senior editor at Haaretz Daily and a former Gaza correspondent for the Jerusalem Post and Criminal Investigation Department of the Israel Defense Force, and Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. Thank you both for being with us today for this discussion. Before we discuss, let's take a look at what our viewers had today with Ayman Sikzek. Ayman, what do you have for us?
Yes, good evening, David. As you began to explain, the military advocate general, Dani Efroni, has announced that the IDF will conduct criminal investigations into exceptional incidents reported during Operation Protective Edge in Gaza. But should the military conduct this process or leave it to the international community? We invited our viewers to join the debate. We asked them, following the criminal investigation into Operation Protective Edge, should the IDF investigate itself? Now, Major General Efroni also approved for publication information on the findings of 7 reports of fault in conduct by IDF forces. So how did our viewers respond to this information? Let's take a look at the results of our daily poll. As you can see, David, 48% voted yes and 49% voted no. So a very close call here between the answers today. But let's review what our viewers shared with us today on Twitter and Facebook. First up, David Turner tells us, yes, in the U.S., every police department has an internal affairs division that reviews police activity. The U.S. Army has something similar as well. It's part of what makes an organization, he says. So he's using the U.S. as a model here, which is an interesting point of comparison, the military forces of both countries. Our next respondent, David Efremov, says, yes, if there is solid evidence indicating that military crimes were committed, but absolutely not if the point is just to showcase the IDF's adherence to the international law. Now, this is also an important point to consider, the pressure that Israel is under from the international community. How does this affect the decision to conduct investigations? Let's take a look at one more comment. Angelique writes to us in French. I'll translate. She says, of course not. We were at war during Protective Edge. Why should Israel have to justify its response? And this was a sentiment shared by many viewers today who feel that Protective Edge was a reaction on Israel's part and that this eliminates the need for an investigation. Most of all, David, it seems our viewers today were questioning the motives for the IDF investigation rather than whether there is or there isn't a need for them to be conducted. I'm sure you and your guests will have more to say about this in your debate, David. Sending it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ayman Sikzek, for that look at our viewer responses. Now, Colonel Kemp, where's the precedent for this type of investigation? What does the British Army do in this type of situation?
Well, the British Army, of course, does exactly the same thing. And we have a series of ongoing investigations now by our Ministry of Defence into what our armed forces have done in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So I think every accountable army in a democratic state, Israel, UK, United States, carry out the same kind of investigation into what its forces have done.
What about this level of international scrutiny, though, that goes on the Israeli case? Is that unusual in this type of situation?
I think it is. I mean, of course, there are some circumstances in which international scrutiny takes place over what Britain has done, what the United States have done. But I think, as with Israel, as Israel has decided in relation to the UN investigation that's taking place, there's no way Britain would its armed forces or its government would cooperate with a similar investigation either, any more than Israel would, because of course we have our own mechanisms, external mechanisms such as the International Criminal Court and other international bodies exist to investigate countries which do not have the capability or the responsibility or the accountability to investigate themselves.
Speaking of investigating themselves, Mr. Burston, can or should the Israel Defense Force investigate its own actions? Where's the legitimacy in that?
Well, I think everybody in law enforcement, in the military, has to have a mechanism to investigate itself. It is certainly not optimal in the sense that there's a built-in problem of objectivity and the problem of whether an organization which is hierarchical can actually be objective in investigating itself. I understand that, and there's also the element of camaraderie that you need, morale within a military organization, which can be sapped by an investigation and the kinds of consequences that may ensue. On the other hand, you don't have a choice. Especially in a place like Israel, where so many people are involved in the military and so personally, the military absolutely has to explain to the country what it's done, and when something has gone wrong, why something went wrong.
What effect can that have on morale? Where in this example, as you mentioned, such a high percentage of the population is either directly involved or 1 degree removed from involvement in this conflict or in conflicts in general. How does that type of investigation, or what message does that send to the public?
Well, it's a difficult problem, because there's one message that it's sending domestically, and there's another message that it's sending internationally. If Israel stonewalls or even actively interferes with international investigations, and I understand why they would not want to passively cooperate, but if it actively stonewalls investigations, as it has done in the past, it sends the wrong message. It sends the message that Israel has something to hide, even when it may not.
Israel's been burned by international investigations in the past through the UN, which have been recanted later on following recent conflicts in Gaza. Does that set the precedent here for, no, we're going to go at this on our own?
Well, the problem is that there's always a delicate balance. I mean, you have to find the balance between sapping morale and sort of leaving yourself vulnerable to attack because you give away too much, and the opposite, which is to shut down and say, don't question. You're going to have to take it on faith, because that leaves you vulnerable to the feeling that you have something to hide.
Is Israel opening itself up to be somewhat more vulnerable in this situation by getting into these specific cases, investigating their actions, or is this really just a necessity after a conflict like this, a conflict embedded in a densely populated area? It's just simply the right thing to do? Well,
of course, if the investigations lead to criminal action, to actual prosecutions, and it's found that people did break the law, then of course there'll be many people in Israel and particularly around the world who want to bash Israel over the head with those findings.
Perhaps are waiting to do so.
They're waiting. They're absolutely eager and determined to do it. But of course, Israel has no choice. Israel is a democratic country. It abides by the laws of armed conflict, and it clearly must investigate any instances of breaches of its own laws and of international law. It has no choice about it.
What do you say to much of the criticism, criticizing the legitimacy of this type of check? In Operation Cast Lead, for example, in 2008 and 9, the stiffest penalty, I think, handed out to an IDF soldier has to do with credit card fraud or theft. And a lot of outsiders criticize that, saying, well, this really wasn't much of an investigation to what many international organizations call a list of war crimes. What's your response to that type of criticism, that it doesn't matter what the IDF says about itself, it's not legitimate?
Well, I don't know the detail of every single case. I have no reason myself to believe any more than I would believe of the British forces or the American forces that there wouldn't be a thorough investigation and as far as justice, as far as the time between the action happening and the investigation taking place and the confusion of war, that a legitimate investigation and the appropriate punishment would not be issued when necessary. I don't have any reason to think that. I'm well aware of a number of cases where soldiers have alleged, and I think it was in your newspaper, I think in Haaretz, among other things, and The Guardian in England, where soldiers alleged criminal activity by their own people during Operation Cast Lead. But having looked at all that, I couldn't. If I'd been investigating it, if I'd been judging on it, on the basis of what I saw, I wouldn't have found people criminally liable for many of those offences.
That was a follow-up question for me here. In your professional military experience, and you followed this conflict closely, I know. What's your assessment of how things played out? Do you see this as a war that necessitates an intensive criminal investigation on the Israeli soldiers, or not? This is obviously a conflict being fought in a situation that isn't really comparable to any other fights around the world, at least the intensity of the scale of this type of conflict.
I think there are many comparisons that you can draw between this conflict and others. It's not quite the same, for example, as our actions in Afghanistan or Iraq, because this is a conflict between two states. De facto, Gaza is an independent state. Israel is. This is not internal. This is not a counterinsurgency operation. So I think, but there are many comparisons as well. There are the use of human shields, the deliberate intention by Hamas to lure Israeli forces into carrying out attacks and killing their own civilian population. I think these things, these are common factors that we've experienced in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. That does not mean that Israel must not investigate them. I think that civilian casualties are an absolute inevitability. The latest data I have seen, the latest objective data I have seen, would suggest that around 50% of the number of people killed in Gaza during the latest conflict were actively involved in fighting Israel, and around 50% were uninvolved civilians. Now if that's right, and I don't know if it's 100% correct, I think it's still a work in progress. If that's right, then it's actually significantly less, for example, than the ratio in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we're looking at an average of 3 civilians killed for every single fighter killed. So
specifically
3 to 1,
in large campaigns that the U.S. government waged in Fallujah, for example, much higher ratios of civilian deaths than what we saw in Gaza this summer. Mr. Burston raised a good point about the somewhat ambiguity surrounding much of the statistics, much of the facts now that have come out of this war this summer in Gaza. You have various sides arguing different points here. How then do you draw, as an investigative body, how do you draw the criteria for what to investigate and which incidents to pursue?
Well, I think that there are a number of specific incidents that the Army already knows about. In fact, there may be as many as 100 or more that the Army knows about, in which there is a serious question as to whether the Army's own procedures were followed. And so that's one level of investigation. And the question is whether the Army's procedures were followed or not. And in many of the cases of civilian casualties, there may have been a variance from Army procedure, and that may explain what happened. And then you have to find out, why that happened and at what level. But beyond that, there's another question. The Army owes it to itself to find out what happened in all of these cases. The Army has to learn from this conflict because it's unlikely to be the last one. And the Army itself pays a price for high civilian casualties. There's no question that soldiers and certainly pilots and others are not immune from the effects of knowing that they're going into an urban area where there are likely to be large numbers of civilian casualties. And when they find out what the level of civilian casualties are, some of which are certainly unavoidable and some which may have been avoidable, it takes a tremendous toll on the fighting personnel. And so the Army really owes it to itself and to the country to investigate each of these incidents in the hope that things like this can be avoided in the future.
Colonel Kemp here. The Israeli military faced challenges and situations in the Gaza Strip here that certainly put it to the test. Let's say, how does a military deal with the situation that we've seen in Gaza this summer, where both sides of the conflict are not held to the same standard in terms of operation, in terms of how they operate on the battlefield now? As a challenge for a modern military, for the Israel Defense Force now, what lessons were learned from this conflict in terms of, as we mentioned, another conflict potentially around the corner, that this just being maybe another link in the chain here in a series of conflicts, face-off between Israel and Hamas now? Was this a positive chapter in the Israel Defense Force in that battle against Hamas?
I think it's a very good point that's just been brought out, that it's almost, if not as important, that the IDF learns the lessons from its own failings and mistakes in order that it can put them right for next time, as bringing people to justice. It's an extremely important thing, and quite right that the toll is taken on soldiers, whether Israeli soldiers or anyone else, who is put in a position where they end up killing innocent civilians. Many of them find it very hard to live with themselves, forever again, even if it was done completely, unavoidably. And I think I looked at the conflict quite closely. I was here for most of it, and I got as close to it as I possibly could. I felt that the Israeli government and IDF policies for minimizing civilian casualties.
The unprecedented multi-tiered warning system, for example.
Indeed, and I felt that they were transmitted very effectively down the chain of command. I spoke to young private soldiers, young engineers who were going into tunnels, into the unknown. And I felt they understood it just as clearly as the generals I spoke to understood it, which is actually something somewhat unusual in armies. Quite often you find that orders transmitted from above don't necessarily translate down to the bottom end. And I think that was also agreed by General Dempsey recently, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, who came out with his statement when asked that that the IDF had taken immense steps to try and prevent the loss of innocent civilian lives. So it's not just the
which goes
Israelis
against much of the
learning.
mainstream narrative, that much of the criticism that came out against this conflict. Your response to that notion? I know a UN facility was hit with at least 16 people killed. In short, we have 30 seconds left. Do you feel that the proper investigations will be done?
I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. I think a very thorough and conscientious investigation can certainly mitigate and even perhaps prevent a witch hunt from abroad.
So it's a critical piece of the narrative, piece of the step towards recovering from the conflict. Bradley Burston, thank you very much for being with us. Colonel Kemp as well. Appreciate your contribution to this debate. That's all for the Daily Debate here. I'm David Matlin. We'll be back after the break with One on One.